Welcome everyone to our Protective and Preventative Services for E-MDTs webinar. We've got two wonderful presenters with us today, and we will get started with our content. All right, so we did our brief welcome, but just make sure that if you're joining us today, you have the correct screen as well as making sure you're muted. And on the next slide, we will go through some, first we'll do the disclaimer, and then we'll go through some housekeeping items. So this disclaimer you've seen before. This just indicates that this event was awarded through a grant through the Office of Victims of Crime, through the DOJ, and the opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations made throughout this presentation are those of our contributors and do not necessarily represent or policies of the US DOJ. Next slide. All right, some housekeeping items just to get us started. Make sure that you are muted if you are not speaking, just to prevent any feedback that we might have on Zoom today. Feel free to use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. We would love to engage with you today, either through unmuting or through the chat, whatever you're comfortable with. Make sure that your name indicates the name you'd like to be referred to during this time. And feel free to also use the raise hand function if you have a question or a comment. We do have a smaller group today, so we won't be using breakout rooms, and there will be plenty of time to engage with our presenters. And of course, if you have any technical issues, please reach out to me. The best way to reach out to me actually is through a direct message in the Zoom chat, and I'd be happy to help you out with any technical questions. I'm going to turn it over to our two presenters to introduce themselves and get started diving into some content.
Hi, everybody. Glad to be here today and to talk to all of you. We're going to talk a little bit about protective versus preventive services, and a lot of it's going to be discussion based. So I'm glad to be here and glad to have you with us. I'll introduce myself. I'm Andrew Capehart. I'm the director of the Adult Protective Services Technical Assistance Resource Center at WRMA, which is a TriMetrix company based in Washington, D.C. I have a 24+ year history in adult protective services and elder abuse issues. I started out as an APS caseworker in Columbus, Ohio. I ran the APS program in Columbus, Ohio for a while. It's where I live now. I worked at the National Center on Elder Abuse for a little bit, and I was deputy director for the National Adult Protective Services Association for 7 years. And then I came to the APS TARC about 5 years ago, and I've been here ever since. So glad to be here, and I'll let Jennifer introduce herself.
Thanks, Andy. I'm Jennifer Kirchen, and I'm also with the APS TARC and WRMA. And like Andy, my experience is very similar to his. I started out as an APS investigator 23 years ago, was an investigator for 7 years before kind of rising through the ranks of a county-based adult protection system in Minnesota. Decided that I was going to get out of the cold and moved to Arizona, which is where I am now, and directed the program there, the APS program there for 3 years. And I've been with the APS TARC and WRMA for about 2 years now. So,
and I say this all the time, Jennifer's the only person I know who has run 2 separate state APS programs, which is just a really cool set of qualifications. So.
Well, I appreciate that. I think that it does lend itself to having a good understanding of like a county-based system and a state-administered system, because with the audience that we are speaking to today, you probably are in all of those kinds of states. So I can empathize with the struggles, and hopefully we can shed some light on how to deal best with APS and how to maybe have some tips and tricks of dealing with APS programs. So we're going to go over our learning objectives, and this is going to be super informal today. We really want to be as open and discussion based as possible. So feel free to chime in either the chat or you can unmute yourself and talk us up for a little bit. But we today are going to be learning about APS and how the E-MDT interacts with APS. And after attending the webinar today, you'll be able to better articulate the difference between protective and preventative services. I know that that's the kind of the title of the webinar, but we're going to go a little further into kind of those surface words. You'll be able to understand what protective services and service plan items are appropriate for APS, as well as learn how APS can collaborate with community agencies to utilize resources to assist with service plans identified by the E-MDT. So we're going to start off today with a poll. And again, we are taking chat comments. We are taking verbal comments, so you can unmute your mic if you'd like. But today, which best reflects your work? And I've got a rating system of 1 through 7 here. Are you most closely defined as a social worker, law enforcement, APS, medical services, mental health, legal, or housing? Senior housing. So you can just shout it out, and if you care to elaborate, maybe there are some that have multiple things in their background.
And while you're responding to that, if you want to put it in the chat or what have you, I know we alluded to, the two different systems that Jennifer's worked in, state-based and county-based. Some of you were probably from the different types of APS systems. And there are 15, I believe, county administered states where each county has their own separate program. The rest of the states are state administered, so that the APS workers are actually state employees and may cross county lines and, work in different parts of the state, not just within one county. So if you're not familiar with those two different kind of archetypes of APS, it's good to know.
Just a reminder, the choices, and I didn't give an other choice. So if you have something else that you want to put in the chat, if you don't fit into one of those buckets, but social work, law enforcement, APS, medical, mental health, legal, or senior housing.
Looks like a couple folks identify as APS. That's great. You may be able to chime in and piggyback on some of what we're going to talk about today with your own experience. Law enforcement, court system, elder abuse exploitation, identify more as law enforcement, E-MDT coordinator, 28 years with Health and Human Services, past 11 years at APS. Oh, it's second day on the job for some folks, so
welcome.
Give you all kinds of cool information. Social worker, elder abuse, financial abuse. Great.
All right.
Legal services.
Gives us a pretty good idea of who we're talking to. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So we're going to start with kind of an introduction to APS and build on from there. So as far as like definitions go, I want to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page. So APS is obviously Adult Protective Services. I know that most of you know that, but APS is the safety net for vulnerable individuals or vulnerable adults. And when we talk about vulnerable adults, as we described earlier on, each state is a little bit different than the next. So there aren't really two states that have exact definitions across the board. So most states have either an 18 plus definition. So if you're an adult, 18 years of age or older, and then there are some other factors. It might be a disability factor. It might be an unable to protect yourself factor. It might be unable to meet your own basic needs. So there's kind of a broad spectrum of definitions across the nation. Some are a definition that is 60 plus. So they're their age base is a little different than, maybe neighboring states that have an 18 plus definition, but just wanted to be aware that everybody on the call probably isn't dealing with the same state with the same definition of a vulnerable adult. And the same would go for maltreatment. Maltreatment is defined as abuse, neglect, self-neglect, or exploitation. And all those definitions vary from state to state, but APS does provide an investigation when adult maltreatment is alleged, i.e. protective services.
And if just to piggyback on what Jennifer said, there's a few nuances in some states. For instance, there's at least one state that will only investigate financial exploitation of government dollars, not of any other kind of funding, private money. They'll only investigate when it's, again, government dollars. And there's some that even have suspicious death, I believe is how it's defined. There's a handful of states that include that as one of the things that APS investigates. And then, more subtle nuances there from there on about different types of maltreatment. So,
yep. So the fourth point on this slide is about federal funding. And so this is part of the reason why you have so many differences in adult protection from state to state, because previous to this last federal fiscal year, there wasn't any ongoing funding for APS. You've probably heard about ARPA or CRSA and the money that was tied to APS through both of those grant cycles. But prior to that, there were state enhancement grants that were funding APS in small portions, but it wasn't a continuous process, and states had to apply for it with a specific project in mind. So with ARPA and CRSA, so the COVID relief and the American Rescue Act funding, each state got a pretty sizable, state and territory got a pretty sizable amount of money to enhance their adult protective services program. And those funds went kind of the gamma again of things that each state saw as kind of a priority. So some states just went with the basics, like they didn't have cell phones for their workers, so they bought cell phones. They bought system upgrades for their case management system. They purchased wraparound services. So, there wasn't a funding source to fix hot water heaters or furnaces or pay for emergency food or things like that. So it's kind of the gamma of what each state used those funds for, but know that those funds are time limited. CRSA or the COVID relief are coming to the end in September, and then ARPA will follow that in the years come. But just know that that's kind of part of the whole mix of APS and how there isn't that continuity from state to state because there isn't federal regulations that tied. Now, with federal fiscal year 2023, states are going to get 15 million across the board, but that's 15 million for everybody. So ACL will slice and dice that and decide how much every state's going to get, but that will be a drop in the bucket compared to what states have gotten through ARPA and COVID. So it won't be enough to support the kinds of projects that they have embarked on in the last 2 years, but it will be something. And this is so important. I know that Andy and I speak about this continuously in our 20 plus years of experience. We never thought that we would see dedicated federal funding to APS, and that's something that we are seeing in our lifetime. So it's so heartwarming that there is that recognition for what adult protective services does for states, but at the same time, $15 million is going to be a drop in the bucket compared to the kinds of things that they've been able to do with the 2 grant cycles prior. Did you want to say anything about that?
Although there has been, the president's budget has proposed additional funds, which I think, don't quote me on this, would take it up to 48 million. That has not been approved by Congress yet. So, knock on wood, there will be more, but at least 15 million has been allotted. And just like Jennifer said, even though it may not be the exact amount that everyone wants, it's still pretty amazing that there are federal funds now coming down the pike for APS. The other thing too that you may or may not have heard of, and Jennifer, I hope I'm not jumping the gun if you were going to talk about this, are the regulations. For the first time ever, there are regulations for adult protective services that are on the way. So at least I should say the federal government has published an intent to regulate adult protective services. So you may see that, in the years to come, that there are some actual federal regulations for adult protective services that have never been in place before, which is really pretty interesting.
Yeah, super interesting. And I think that as we talk about funding and regulation, all of that is going to be succinct with moving the program forward and having that continuity, those expectations of states. Similar to Child Protective Services, Adult Protective Services hasn't had that. So once we have the federal funding and the federal regulations, there will be more similarities from state to state and expectations of states. All right, and the last bullet on this slide is about working with partners collaboratively to provide services to fill gaps after the investigation. And this is where the whole MDT mentality comes into play, who sits on them, etc. So most states that have MDTs in their statute or regulations have pretty prescriptive notes about who might sit on the MDT, whether it be prosecutors, law enforcement. There are states that have kind of internal MDTs, systematic internal MDTs where it's just APS, prosecutor, law enforcement. And then there are others that are more expansive that include public health nursing. They might have hospitals. They might have advocacy groups or provider groups. All of those that do open it up a little bit further have confidentiality agreements so that information kind of can remain internally and that's not shared with others. But that's kind of where your E-MDTs come into play too, probably as an offshoot of an APS MDT or as that primary MDT. But just know that that purpose of MDTs, at least from an adult protective services premise, is to really collaborate together to offer additional services, because as an adult protection staff, Andy and I both fully are aware that APS can't do everything ourselves. We need our partners to help process these cases. We don't have the resources, we don't have the manpower, we don't have the tools in our toolbox to complete these cases in a silo. So having that MDT presence is really important to help facilitate a good outcome for these clients or these victims. Next slide. So I just wanted to talk about some changes for APS that you're probably aware of, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page. APS practice really evolved and changed due to the pandemic because there were obstacles that APS didn't really plan for in engaging clients and systems during the pandemic. So face-to-face, that became not so much of an option during the pandemic. So folks had to come up with other strategies, whether it be purchasing PPE or different technologies so that you weren't having to expose yourself or potential victims to COVID-19. So a lot of states, like I said earlier, use their COVID or ARPA money on technology, whether it be an iPad that they could drop off at the door, and then you would communicate via iPad and a hotspot that was on a cell phone, whether it be PPE, so you could have a mask and give the victim a mask during that interview, but a lot happened during the pandemic that wasn't necessarily foreseeable, and APS systems had to kind of pivot in the way that they were doing things, and they weren't able to do things as they were doing it before. Many APS programs went into a virtual model where they were conducting their visits virtually, whether that be via a cell phone, via an iPad, a computer, sometimes even a telephone if they didn't have access to the internet, maybe in remote places where they couldn't get Wi-Fi, they had to call on the phone, which isn't necessarily a best practice or a promising practice, but something that they had to do because of the pandemic. So I feel like in the history of APS, it's always better to go and do a look-see on the client and do a face-to-face to make sure that they're doing okay. But in many instances, that just wasn't a possibility. So in the funding that I mentioned earlier, I wanted to talk about the enhancements that that were required as a result of that funding source. So in order for states to get that funding, the Administration for Community Living required an operational plan. And I think that from my standpoint, operational plan was a very foreign kind of suggestion to states. As a former APS program director in 2 different states, if somebody came to me and said, okay, well, here's this money and we're going to give you this money, but you have to be really strategic about that money and very visionary and set up a mission and a vision and all of those things that are kind of, when you're working in a program, difficult to work on your program. You're trying to keep the lights on, you're trying to process those investigations. It's hard to be forward thinking, but in the context of this money, we really wanted to focus on system improvements and working in their program while working on their program so that they could carry that progress or those enhancements in a 3 to 5 year cycle, which was kind of where that funding was going to end, based on extensions, because each funding stream was 2 years, and then with the possibility of extending for a year after. So when APS administrators were thinking about this, they are typically thinking about testing strategies with new funding, but not typically a preventative kind of state. So it was kind of a new way of thinking. APS is more reactionary. You know, we get the report, we respond to the report, we hopefully resolve the maltreatment issue and protect that person from further maltreatment. But to be preventative is kind of a strategy that most states aren't looking nor are funded to entertain. I will say, with the pandemic funding, there are some states that are looking at preventative kinds of methodology and strategies in a pilot program to see if that works, to kind of infuse more resources so that people aren't necessarily coming into the adult protection system. But again, pilot, not all the states are looking at that, but just kind of the difference between preventative and protective as we talk today. Anything else you want to say about that, Andy?
No, just that some of the prevention strategies are pretty interesting. We saw a lot of public awareness, a lot of people trying to make sure that others were aware that there's someone who can help, like Adult Protective Services. Yeah, so it was kind of fascinating to see some of the preventative strategies that were out there.
Yeah, so I think that overall, what this boils down to is you may have seen more obstacles in the past in dealing with APS, and maybe those obstacles are lessened now because there is federal funding that, now limited obviously, that is really providing kind of a source of opportunities to do more networking, more service referrals, that kind of thing, where maybe in the past it was more difficult to engage APS because there just wasn't anything that APS could do because there wasn't any solution.
We see some really cool programs like Tennessee, for instance, that has a kind of ongoing case management component to it. They may stay involved with cases longer than APS typically does to try and keep cases from coming back. Sometimes it's not just about preventing the abuse, but it's about keeping it from recurring, I think. Sure.
Yeah, and I think that other strategies that other states have tried to develop through this funding, experts in self-neglect or experts in financial exploitation. They have added APS nurses, and this is not across the board, obviously, but different strategies that different states are trying to evoke to see what's going to be the best long-term for their strategies. And if they have some data behind 2 to 4 years of funding, they could go back to their state leadership and say, hey, look of what the great things that we did with this funding through the federal government. Now, could we think about legislation or allowance of paying for these services through a state budget? So kind of a demonstration grant where they've demonstrated the need, they've demonstrated what group good they could do through this additional funding. And now could they do something for sustainability on the state level? Okay.
Before I jump in to talk about APS limitations, and I know we have some APS people on the call, are there any questions thus far about what we've talked about? Some of this new money, some of these new programs that you see, any examples from these programs that you see in your community, although we'll have a chance to talk about that in a little bit too. But we'd love to hear from any of you if you have questions so far. Okay, well, hearing none, I'll jump right in, and I may not go through a lot of detail with this so we can get to some of the questions, especially since there are folks who are, kind of familiar with APS, but these are some things you may already know. Time limits. APS must close cases according to statutory guidelines. Some states are required by law to close cases within 30, 60 days. I think 60 days actually is the threshold. So they can't keep it open at all past 60 days. Although you see some APS programs that will keep cases open for longer periods of time, 90 days, even longer than that, when necessary. But that's the exception to the rule. Usually APS will complete an investigation, maybe open it for a brief period of time. Sometimes they can't even do that, and then move on to the next case because the APS system is set up to do the investigation and then move on and help as many people as possible. APS is not able to provide ongoing adult services in most states, so they need to find these services, whether it be through waiver programs or other programs, in order to help the victims that they see, because they can't provide these direct services for any long period of time. One of the things that I think Jennifer alluded to earlier was some of these services that have been set up by the COVID funding that's new, but these are usually emergency temporary services, sometimes used as a Band-Aid, for lack of a better word, until permanent services can be put in place for someone, or more permanent services put in place. For instance, an APS worker may go to a home, find that there's no food, so they may set up home delivered meals for that person immediately, pay for those meals for a couple weeks until some sort of permanent funding source can kick in and pay for those meals on an ongoing basis. So, but you'll find that, in the vast majority of APS programs, they're not able to pay for any real length of time for services. They have to find a more permanent funding source. Service gaps exist, especially in rural areas. We do see in urban areas more resources, obviously. In rural areas, sometimes people can get things done because they know folks, but usually, most of the resources exist in the more urban areas, and it's harder to find the types of services that folks need in rural areas. So if you work in a rural area, you're probably already familiar with that challenge, but your APS folks are certainly going to face that sort of challenge. And adults with capacity can refuse services. So this is probably something that you're familiar with as well. When APS gets a report and someone is concerned about that person, older adults have the right to refuse services. Those services are not going to be imposed on them except in the extreme situations where a court order or a guardian is put in place. Those are really very, very few in number compared to the majority of APS cases. You don't see that happen very often. This is the line between APS and CPS. You know, when you're dealing with child protective services, children can't make their own decisions. Adults, anyone over the age of 18 is assumed to be able to make that decision unless a physician or a psychologist or psychiatrist decides otherwise, and a judge, you know, adjudicates that person as not being able to make their own decisions. And again, that's in the minority of cases. And year over year, reports are increasing without the staff to support increases generally. So we're not seeing, we're seeing case numbers go up, but we're not seeing the staff numbers go up. And I think one of the things that we'll probably touch on at some point is that there's a real lack of staff in APS. There's really high turnover in APS. But that's really a workforce issue. It's not something that's unique to APS, but we certainly see it in APS. There is more and more turnover, and states are having problems with recruiting and retaining APS workers and keeping their workforce in the field after they've been educated and gone through training, which can take a decent amount of time. Jennifer, I don't know if there's anything you want to say about any of those bullet points or piggyback on any of that.
Well, I think that you hit on kind of the high points. The time limits for investigations kind of vary. So I was in a state that had a 60-day statutory mandate that we investigate that case within 60 days. And as you can imagine, some cases just can't be resolved within 60 days. You're waiting on bank records, you're waiting on law enforcement records. So, or you're waiting for law enforcement to conduct a criminal investigation. So you're kind of taking that back seat on the civil investigation. So it just can't happen. And as those cases are or should be coming to a close, they have to stay open, and you're getting more cases. And so it kind of, it's kind of a perfect storm, you might say. You've got cases that are taking longer and longer to process. You've got a staffing shortage, so you don't have as many people to take, you know, the onslaught of cases that are coming in. And then you've got these investigative timelines that are contingent on partner participation that doesn't always happen within the timeline that you think it should happen.
Right.
So I think that this perfect storm is happening where we've got all this pressure on APS. Now, granted, some of the states have decided to use some of their SRSA or ARPA grant funds to supplement their staff, but it's time limited. It's not ongoing funding. So there is going to be an end to, if they're contracting with a private agency to, you know, kind of come in and fill those open positions, or even trying to get staff raises or bonuses or whatever. A lot of times, and this is something that isn't very well known either, but APS salary isn't necessarily competitive with CPS salary all the time.
Yep.
And so a lot of APS programs are losing staff to CPS because they pay more in CPS. So there's a lot of external factors, and we could probably drone on all day about limitations, but we just wanted to kind of set some expectations about how APS is limited in the kind of work that they're doing.
And it looks like Alicia asked, is that why APS takes a long time to investigate? There are some states that don't have requirements for the investigation, but they're the minority. So handful of states don't have a time frame where the case has to be, the investigation has to be wrapped up. But the majority of them are between 30 and 60 days for sure. So with some of the outliers being 30 days, but 60 or 90 days because of financial exploitation. So financial exploitation cases can be much trickier to investigate because you have to collect a lot of records. You have to sift through them. You may have to even, utilize a forensic accountant, which I believe a lot of people on the line are familiar with, to help you sort out the details of that case. They could take some time. So yeah, the laws vary, but yeah.
And what if APS shows up at my door and I don't want to talk to them?
So in I'm going to say the majority, and I think that's the case, adults have the right to refuse an investigation. In other states, the adult has the right to refuse to participate in the investigation, and the investigation will continue. So there are states where the older adult doesn't want to speak to APS, and that's fine. They don't have to, but APS will talk to collateral contacts hospitals, social workers, banks, anybody they need to gather the evidence or gather the information that they need to make a determination. The only time that an actual investigation is imposed on a client is if it's very, very serious allegation and the APS worker gets a court order, which is not available in every single state. But in most states, that is an option where you can get a court order to require someone to participate in the investigation and answer questions. But even then, there's limitations to that. So, and it does have to be a very, very extreme case before a judge is going to allow something like that to happen. It's a good question.
And like Lisa alluded to, and I assume that this is what you're alluding to, a lot of times APS goes out and tries to make contact and doesn't make contact the first, second, or third time. And so according to policy, each state is going to have a different response. And so if you go out 1, 2, 3 times and you're not able to make contact, you close it. And wait for something else to happen and somebody, else to call in a subsequent time, and maybe that time you can get in. But you can't just keep going out if you're not getting a response. And so that, I don't know if that's what you were alluding to, Lisa, but a lot of times APS just can't make contact with everyone.
It happens. It happens where you're unable to locate the client. It's what we would say in Ohio for some of those cases. Yeah, it's a good question.
Okay.
And some tips for engaging APS, Adult Protective Services staff. Just remember, APS staff are overextended. As we mentioned earlier, the case numbers are going up, and there aren't really more staff that are being hired in proportion to the number of cases that are going up. We've heard from some folks that their cases rose after the pandemic and then evened out. But we've also heard from quite a few states where the numbers went up and never came back down. They're still very, very high. And because of the nature, and I think Jennifer alluded to this, because of the nature of the funding, the federal funding that's out there for APS, and it being mostly time limited, the large sums of money from SRSA and ARPA, they're reticent to hire staff because they know they won't continue to get that money. And so they would have to let people go. They would essentially be hiring temporary caseworkers. And, they don't want to just hire people for a few years and then let them go. So staffing, even though there's more money in APS floating around right now, hasn't really been commensurate with the amount of money that's been dumped into the system because it is temporary. And the $15 million that Jennifer mentioned as well is not going to go very far when it comes down to which states get how much of that money, it's based on a formula from the Elder Justice Act. It could mean very small amounts for states with fewer population.
And I think Stephanie is alluding to it's also hard to find qualified staff. We're competing with other industries that are having huge raises and wage hikes. So APS isn't keeping up with those, even Target or Chipotle. I mean, it seems like they're all getting paid $15+ an hour, and under state contracts, it's a lot to change a position description to indicate that there is a warranted raise or hiring increase for certain positions. So yeah, absolutely, it's hard to find qualified staff.
Absolutely. I just got off a call right before this session where we were talking about workforce issues in APS and the strategies that certain states are using to try and keep people, hire people and keep people and find qualified staff, especially in rural areas. It's a real challenge. Keep in mind that APS staff are being asked to do more with less. The cases are becoming more complex, is what we hear from many different programs, that they're dealing with programs that cases that are, more difficult than they have been in the past to deal with, more complicated, and may even involve polyvictimization with different types of maltreatment. And we've said this already, dealing with staffing deficits. Sometimes staff depart and it's so hard to hire someone that they, are down 1, 2, 3, 4 more people for an extended period of time. Partner resources can make the job easier. There's no doubt that this is true. And you've probably seen this in action with your MDT. I started an MDT in my own community when I was in adult protective services, and it was very, very important to the work that we did. Being able to have point people we could talk to, talk about cases, and find solutions to those cases that we may not have been able to find if we weren't in the same room together. So working with partners is absolutely necessary because APS can't do what they need to in a vacuum. And communication is key. And we know it can be difficult with confidentiality to be able to share information, whether it's on your side or on the adult protective services side. But usually MDTs address this and are able to communicate effectively. Being able to talk about what's happening in the case and being able to share details about that case can be very important. So, but we realize that there's some barriers to that sometimes. And then also, and I think I mentioned this earlier, many APS programs are working on or developing public awareness campaigns, which is a prevention strategy. With this new funding, it's one of the big things we've seen out of this temporary federal funding is doing things like television advertisements or billboards, or videos online talking about adult protective services or posters or what have you. We actually have a toolkit on our website if you'd want to see examples of what some APS programs are doing in the public awareness arena. Just look for the public awareness toolkit on our toolkits page. And we have a page that shows examples of all the different things, including videos that states are doing to help with the prevention aspect of APS, to help folks know that there is an agency that deals with this and that there is something that can be done about it. So, Jennifer, anything you want to piggyback on or any questions anybody has?
I think I'm good. For time purposes, I think that we probably should launch into the questions. We've got some interactive questions. We're hoping that we can ask of you and a dialogue would ensue. So do you want to take the first question, Andy?
Sure. So our first question, what's the difference between prevention and intervention? Anybody have an answer to that? Examples you'd want to give of certain types of programs or certain type of services in the community? Or just your general thoughts on the difference between the two? We mentioned earlier prevention efforts in APS, such as public awareness, ongoing services that would stay involved for a while to keep someone from returning back to the system. Couple examples of prevention. Does anyone have any input on this one?
And I'll take that just a step further, just to maybe facilitate the conversation. So when you think of prevention as it relates to APS, think of, the partner support that you're getting. So you might be working with a hunger program for senior hunger issues. You might be working with public health nursing to do an aging in place assessment or a risk assessment for falls, things like that for prevention.
And Alicia Rodriguez said prevention is educating, for sure. Education is a huge component of prevention. Letting people know. We've done a few webinars in the past couple of years, and we have 2 more planned on frauds and scams, and being aware of frauds and scams, and what the tactics are that are used for older adults and vulnerable adults. So that's a huge piece of prevention. Half the battle can be helping these vulnerable folks understand that that's out there and what to look for if they're called.
So if I could jump in,
Yeah.
in my experience, and you use this as an example of intervention earlier with Meals on Wheels, but Meals on Wheels is a prevention as well.
Yes.
So, your example was Meals on Wheels as an intervention.
Yep.
APS gets involved. They see they don't have food. You give them food. You have a worker who's doing an actual intervention.
Absolutely.
But those folks who are already getting home delivered senior meals, are experiencing a form of prevention. They have a daily visitor. They have nutrition. They have some contact with the outside world.
Yep.
So all of those things work to prevent as well.
That's a great example, especially when other services are provided in addition to home delivered meals. That person may never come to the attention of APS, which is a beautiful thing if it happens. So the lines get crossed a little bit between what is always prevention and intervention, not always clear cut. It's a great example.
To piggyback on that too, if you think about intervention services and you think about they've come into the system, there is a report, and APS is trying to mitigate risk and reduce the likelihood of repeat cases. They meaning APS, might be looking at hoarding services or hoarding cleanup services. They might be referring to mental health services. They might be referring to chemical dependency services, those kinds of things, to intervene on whatever is bringing them into the system as well. So, Krista, your example was spot on. It could be both prevention and an intervention services. Are there any other examples of that anybody else can think of?
It looks like in the chat, Alicia said health fairs, participating in community tribal events, social media, and newsletters. Absolutely. Those are great ways to educate people. When you mentioned educating earlier, or someone did. Absolutely. Good examples of prevention.
Okay. Should we go on to question 2?
I think that's a great idea. What sort of preventive services are offered in your community? So you've talked about some examples. Maybe these are things that are offered in your community, like health fairs, home delivered meals is offered in just about every community. But are there any preventative services that we haven't talked about already that you encounter with folks under MDT in your community? You can think of.
Hopefully we're not putting people to sleep.
Or maybe it's just something you have to think really hard about.
Yeah. Or maybe there aren't preventative services offered in their community.
That's a good point too. I think that there are, especially in rural areas where there's very few services, you may not have a lot of preventative services, or services that you might label as preventative. Maybe they're mostly focused on intervention, which is unfortunate. It's the world that we live in. Well, why don't we move on to the next question?
Stephanie said, my agency has fraud prevention presentation.
That's great. So that's like the webinars I mentioned earlier, where you're talking about, what to look out for, how to keep yourself safe, especially online or by phone. Because some of the fraud and some of the scams are getting very, very sophisticated, kind of insanely sophisticated.
I don't know if anybody else has heard this, but on my local news here in Arizona, we had a spoofer spoof a child's voice.
Yep,
and so they called the family member, whether it be mom or dad, and it was the child's voice saying, "Mom, help me, I'm in trouble." It was like, how do you do that?
Artificial intelligence can do that now. There are websites that can mimic a person's voice. It starts to make it very difficult. And let's see, Krista says, one of my tasks to manage a website called Stay Connected, New Hampshire. Check it out. Yeah, that's great. I'd love to see that. Thank you. Yeah, any type of web campaign, I think, is a great strategy for prevention. Any other preventative services folks can think of? Our third question, have you worked with any APS programs that offer preventative services? And if so, what was your experience? Some of you mentioned early on when we polled where you're from, you said you're with APS. Are there any prevention services offered through your Adult Protective Services program that you'd like to talk about, or are you aware of any with your partners in APS? And what was your experience, if so?
And what's the funding source? Like, how do you actually do a preventative services without a budget?
Or maybe your APS program is utilizing some of the funds that we've talked about earlier today, and are doing public awareness or engaging in some sort of prevention activity.
Or maybe there's a program that has another grant that is funding a preventative service.
That's a good point.
So I'm at risk of contributing too much here.
That's okay.
Which is why I've been trying to be quiet. But so in New Hampshire, APS workers are part of the Bureau of Elderly and Adult Services. And so the Bureau, though, is a much larger agency.
Yeah.
And so the Bureau then filters their Title 20 money through that for homemaking. So APS refers to the homemaking services. Okay. So again, it's not, and that referral can go through anywhere. It doesn't have to come through APS.
Sure.
So that is and it can be provided without regard to income if APS says this is a preventative service.
Absolutely.
So it falls into sort of intervention and prevention. They also work with the service links of New Hampshire. The one in one of the counties, or actually two of the counties, is run through the public health area agency. We actually have a lot, I think. I mean, but I would put under preventative services,
Certainly.
anything that the CAP does. So we've got a very, very active community action programs that, again, we have senior centers. I think senior centers are a perfect example of a preventative service. We have
Yep.
CAP sponsored transportation. So if you have someone who can get you to your doctor's appointments, there's your prevention for self-neglect. There's a nonprofit agency that we just partnered with to do a fraud presentation, but they're called the Interlakes Community Caregivers. It involves 4 communities. They have volunteers who get a small stipend for like travel reimbursement, whatever, but they run as a nonprofit and they do grocery shopping. They bring people to their doctor's appointments. They used to do before COVID a lot more friendly visiting. But since COVID, they kind of had to focus up, as we all did, on things like grocery shopping and whatever. And I could go on and on and on.
That's great.
Because I think, we're a small state, but we have a lot to offer. A lot to offer to anyone. And some of the ARPA money was used by BEAS to create 2 separate grants. One is to pay for for emergency response buttons for folks that need them. And another one is a home modification grant.
Yeah, that's huge too.
And those 2 things are to help people age at home and to prevent, getting involved in the system. So,
and you mentioned senior centers, which, may or may not involve adult protective services in some way, but social isolation is, public enemy number 1, I think.
Exactly what I was going to say.
I took the words out of your mouth for abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Social isolation is, can be deadly, really. And so senior centers are, key.
Right.
Well, and when she talked about friendly home visitors too, I mean, that along with social isolation, sometimes contributes to them picking up the phone and being subject to scammers because they just want somebody to talk to. So I think all of that meshes together in a prevention strategy.
Right.
And Alicia mentioned in chat, didn't know APS programs offer preventative services. They don't always, just to put that disclaimer on things, but we're seeing more and more of that with the increase in funding and the federal funding that came out. You do see that, but it may not necessarily be true of your APS program.
Right. The examples I was using, again, aren't necessarily specific to the APS work, but to the overarching agency, which is the Bureau of Elderly and Adult Services, which is a state administered program. But as an APS worker, so the intervention might have been me showing up once a month because I got them to agree that that was all they would accept. And every time I went to see them, I would say, oh, so did you think about those Meals on Wheels again? Or how about that transportation? Or, the senior companion program, somebody could take you out to get your hair cut once a month. And and I'd do it again the next month.
Building rapport.
I mean, this is a system that is stood up to help support victims and our clients, and we can't do it alone. So that system of the senior center or the home visitors or adult protection or even religious groups. I mean, so many seniors are connected to their church or their community of faith. Like all of that kind of goes together to support that individual.
Right.
Yep. And APS will, investigate maybe exploitation, but they may see neglect or self-neglect when they're in the home. And so they may pick up on that and provide, they're not going to just ignore that. They're going to provide services for that. And further prevention down the line helps with prevention.
All right. I'm going to go to question number 4, Andy. This kind of relates back to that investigative life cycle. How long do you feel like your adult protection programs that you work with keep a case open? And do you think that time is sufficient? So we talked about kind of that range, 30 to 90 days, depending on the type of allegation, depending on if it's extended. What's the optimal timeline and why? So do you get in and try to investigate fast and get the case closed and referred to services, or do you keep it open longer, hoping to build rapport so that when you do refer to services, they actually take you up on that referral? Like, what's best, and what are you seeing out there? And there are no wrong answers here.
No.
I've got some input on this. I think it's a difficult question to answer, especially after you look at the lack of resources in APS programs. Is keeping the cases open longer means that you'll have a higher caseload, and that's going to happen regardless. But voluntarily doing it by keeping cases open longer, which is what has to happen a lot of times with our financial cases, is really difficult. But the piece about building rapport, I think, is so important and almost impossible to do many times in one visit. So you end up being in a situation where you have time constraints and you're not able to get a really good idea of what's going on, but you have to make some pretty quick decisions. And sometimes I feel like those decisions are not correct because we weren't able to spend enough time building that relationship and really determining what's going on. So then you end up with case recidivism and people who are still at risk because we weren't able to gather enough information with the 30-day requirement or the few visits that we were able to have. So I think different situations require different responses, but there's no way to just kind of, say that, I wish there was no restrictions, but I also wish we had as much staff as we need and that we had the resources and the training and the caliber of staff to navigate a lot of these pieces, which it's just not there. The resources aren't there.
Yeah.
That's a non-answer to the question.
Well, you cracked the code.
And Bernadette said, our APS appears to close cases 30 days and believes it should be extended to 60, 90 days. You'll find that a lot of APS folks would probably agree with that. They're not able to, continue the investigation as long as they wanted to. Another person said 45 days in Virginia. And then I've had cases being investigated well over 60 days with no report back, it sounds like. Yeah, in some places there's no requirement at all. They can keep it open for a long time.
Okay. With time being of the essence, I'm going to just kind of skip through. We've got a couple of other questions you certainly can feel free to answer. And then we want to see if you guys have any questions. So what resources are needed among the clients that you serve? What collaborations would you like to see in APS in your community? And have you seen any promising collaborations? And then what are the biggest obstacles to working with APS programs? So any of those answers, any questions, any burning issues that you want to discuss with us today?
You have our contact information up on the screen, so you're welcome to reach out to us anytime.
Hi, this is Bernadette. I just have, I guess, a comment or question. I think one of our biggest challenges is having APS filing the guardianship paperwork. It seems to be like a lot of red tape to get that done. And I'm not sure what the protocol is, but sometimes when we have individuals in crisis, we're kind of sitting there waiting and not sure what to do.
Sure. Yeah, that's got to be frustrating for everybody. And sometimes the courts, it doesn't happen quickly, unfortunately.
Yeah, most states have the ability, if something is imminent, to do an emergency guardianship. But if it is just a general guardianship, it takes a little bit longer. Could be 30 to 60 days, which, obviously no fault of APS, but the court system is backlogged like all the rest of us.
And at one point in New York City, it was taken 9 months or more to get a guardianship put in place. That was years ago, maybe alleviated now, but. All right. Well, thank you so much for having us today. We appreciate it. We hope the information was helpful.
Thank you so much. Everyone, if you could just spend a second filling out that brief evaluation in the chat, that would be great. And let's give a big thank you to both of our presenters, Andrew and Jennifer. You both were wonderful. Please feel free to reach out to them with any questions. They are such a wealth of knowledge. And we loved having you all here with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.